What do you have?
Okay. All right, we're recording. Ready? Okay, we're actually going to go backwards in history a little bit to a period in England known as, or an event in history called the Protestant Reformation. Now, is anybody in here Lutheran? No. And gone through confirmation? I find usually that Catholic students don't know very much about the Protestant Reformation because it doesn't really apply to them very much. But we'll see, maybe some of you can surprise me with your knowledge on this topic. So, in the 16th century, which would be what years? During the 1500s, there was a movement in England to reform the Catholic Church and the Church of England. So during this time in Europe, there were two choices for religion. One of them was the Catholic Church, the old Roman Catholic Church. For me, this is what I kind of think of stereotypically as the Catholic Church. Enormous cathedrals, beautifully decorated, a lot of ceremony and ritual went into Mass. Most cathedrals, even smaller churches, would have multiple masses per day. And each one would last somewhere between 2 to 4 hours. They were conducted in Latin. And it was a really much more formal event than church is today. Okay, so has anybody ever heard of the King of England named Henry VIII?
Yeah.
Okay.
That boy was a wide boy.
That boy was a little crazy. So Henry VIII is most famous because he had 6 wives. And there's actually a little saying that people use to remember his wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. So his first wife was from Spain. This isn't necessarily that important, but you need to know the background here. So his first wife was from Spain. And he desperately wanted to father a son to become heir to the British throne. And his first wife, Catherine, she gave him a daughter. But she had several miscarriages or stillbirths, and none of them were boys. The ones that were stillborn, obviously, they don't know about the miscarried ones. So he wanted to divorce her. Well, the problem was that the Pope had to approve divorces. And the Pope is like, he would know the King of England, not like us commoners. And the Pope refused to approve a divorce agreement for Henry VIII and his wife. So Henry VIII gave the Pope the middle finger and said, I'm starting my own church. So he started his own church called the Church of England. Essentially Catholic.
Is this under protest?
Yes. Essentially the Church of England is Catholic, except they don't have a Pope. The head of the church is Henry VIII, and you can get divorced. Yeah. So Henry VIII forms his own church just so he can get a divorce from his first wife. The second wife couldn't have a baby, so he had her beheaded.
Ooh.
His third wife died during childbirth. His fourth wife, he divorced again because she couldn't give him a son. His fifth wife couldn't have a son, so he had her beheaded. And the sixth one outlived him.
Oh.
Why didn't he what?
Just divorce her. Why do you have to kill her?
He didn't like her.
At some point in my life, we watched it.
Okay. So why did I tell you all this? So during the 1500s, there were 2 options for churches that you could attend: the Catholic Church and the Church of England. Both of them were very similar, and they had some things in common that people started to disagree with. One of those things was selling indulgences. So, in the Catholic Church, how is a sin forgiven?
Money.
Confession.
Confession.
Money.
It's actually called reconciliation in its
Whatever you want to call it.
technical term.
Yeah.
So you go to a little box and you sit and you tell the priest, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. It's been 12 days since my last confession, and since then I have," and you list off what you've done, and then the priest says, "Do 3 Hail Marys and 2 Our Fathers, and your sins will be forgiven." Okay?
I can't.
Well, by the 1500s, European society had kind of formed into a lot of small towns. So imagine if you live in a town like Greeley and you have to travel all the way to Grand Island to see a priest. And you don't have time to do that on a daily basis, right? You can't make it that far normally. So the Catholic Church hired these people to go out and sell forgiveness. And then those people would bring the money back to the church, and the bishops would get richer and richer. And so there were some people who said, "You know what? This isn't right. This is not what God would have wanted for me to pay." So the richer you were, the higher up in the church you could get, because you could buy your way through indulgences to the top. You could do horrible crimes and be forgiven, or on the contrary, you could do a petty crime but not be able to afford to have your sin forgiven. Make sense? And so if you're thinking to yourself, that doesn't sound very legit, sounds like a scheme. It was a scheme initiated by the church to try to boost revenue, and it kind of failed in part because it caused some people to break away. The second thing, well, there's actually more than 2 things. People also disliked all the rituals associated with the church. They didn't like the taxes that the church was assessing through the form of tithes. What's another word for tithes? Anybody know? Starts with an O. My church doesn't call it tithing, they call it giving and offering. So tithes are it's like a tax that you owe your church. It's paid quarterly usually, or weekly in modern society. Well, back in the 1500s, you were expected to tithe as much as 40% of your income to the church. Okay? And people, the problem with it is, if they were using that money for good, the citizens might not have had quite as many problems with it. But what they were using it for was to pad the pockets of the church officials. So the bishop comes rolling out in a Lexus, and you can't even afford to make your payment on your Ford.
Oh my God.
Okay? Obviously they didn't have vehicles, but you get the analogy, right?
They come out with
The
curses,
bishops
you know.
and priests were getting richer and richer, and the common people weren't even able to buy more cloth to make their garments. Okay? So, people started getting frustrated with the Catholic Church. Right in the name, the Protestant Reformation, what word do you get out of this? Protest. So, that's how we remember. The Protestant Reformation is a protest with the goal of reforming the Catholic Church. So people started splitting off. They said, "You know what, I'm not going to go to Catholic Church. Me and my friends here who disagree, we're going to form our own church." Well, that was against the law, especially to King Henry VIII, who was a tyrant anyway. So he started ordering these people who were not going to church and saying, "I'm not Catholic," or "I'm not in the Church of England, so I don't have to pay your taxes." He started burning villages, killing innocent civilians, and which just led to more and more unrest. Well, in Germany, a gentleman by the name of
Martin Luther King Jr.
Martin Luther is generally thought of as the father of the Protestant Reformation. Although he wasn't the only person, he's kind of the most famous. He wrote a document called the 95 Theses, which is 95 reasons why the Catholic Church should not exist anymore. So, 95 problems that he saw with the Catholic Church. The 3 top ones are the ones I just told you about. Tithing, rituals, indulgences. Those are the 3 chief complaints. So, Martin Luther and these other guys, they started writing new doctrine, new documents that would govern new churches. And Martin Luther started a new form of religion called Lutheranism, right? Most other popular modern day religions like Methodism, Presbyterian, Baptist, all were formed during this time period. That's why Protestant churches are generally very similar. Now, Lutheranism is really the closest to Catholicism. Lutherans take communion every week, just like Catholics. Most other religions don't do that. Like, for instance, in my church, we only take communion 1 time a month. Yes. Baptists, in some Baptist churches, they don't even take communion. They have other ways of, well, let me ask you this. What's the point of communion, those of you who are baptized and good religious folks?
You're receiving the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so in the Catholic Church, it's generally considered a way for the mortal soul to have a part of the Holy Spirit within you.
Yeah.
Okay? What were you going to say?
Why not just drink the water then?
Okay, in some churches, it's more to remember the sacrifices that God and Jesus made for you. Okay? And so in other churches, they have other ways to encourage those things rather than drinking wine. Which my church doesn't drink wine. Does yours drink real wine?
Yeah, we have wine
Yep.
and grape juice.
So Catholics still drink real wine. Most Lutheran churches that I've ever been to, at least or heard about, still drink regular wine. We drink juice. I think most Baptists drink juice. We eat bread. We eat like real bread.
We do too.
We do too.
Catholics have these little wafers that,
They look like paper, Thomas.
No, see,
Yeah. Okay,
We looked it up.
They look like
Everybody
paper
got that
cups,
down?
Thomas.
alright, so the next heading you should have something that you already know about. What is one of the groups that forms out of the Protestant Reformation? Puritans.
Those Mormons.
So, the next heading in this set of notes can be called the Puritans. Now, we already talked about this, that Puritan comes from the word purify. So, the Puritans, their goal, which you should kind of know this already because we've talked about the Puritans a lot, but they wanted to purify Christianity. What they wanted to do was go back to the Bible. Specifically, the Old Testament form of the Bible. Now, you good religious folks, what's not the fact that Jesus is in one and not the other, what is the biggest difference between the lessons in the Old Testament versus the New Testament? Anybody know?
Jesus was there in the New Testament after he died.
Reverse.
What?
The Old Testament after he died.
The new, okay.
Oh, boy,
The Old Testament is the
everything leading
The
up
Old
to
Testament
Jesus.
tells the story of the creation of earth up through the birth, the
Up
announcement
to-
that Jesus is coming. The New Testament begins when basically Mary gets pregnant, miraculously.
Immaculate.
Okay, but can anybody tell me anything about the lessons, the kind of teachings from the Old Testament versus the New Testament?
Like the New Testament is more of like life lessons, I guess you could say, and the Old Testament is just kind of like how things.
Okay, so the Old Testament is a lot of pages explaining all these different things that happen. There's a line from Hamilton where it's right after the second act starts, when Hamilton and Aaron Burr are the lawyers, you know, and he says, I worked as a lawyer, Burr worked next door, and Hamilton is trying, as an attorney, he's trying the first murder trial in the United States, and he says, everything we do sets a precedent. What's precedent mean? Remember?
Hopefully you point at me.
You need to know. Starts with an E. You're right. Say it.
Example.
Sets an example. So when you're doing something new, you're setting a precedent on which future decisions are going to be made. Okay, so the Puritans want to go back to the Old Testament when God was setting precedents. Okay, anybody know the story where God tells this couple to walk away from their past life and start over new, and he will give them everything they need? And he says, whatever you do, don't look back. And they're walking away, and the woman turns and looks back at the life she's leaving behind and turns into a pillar of salt.
She's
God
salty.
was a vengeful presence in the Old Testament. When people did not follow his directions, he lashed out at them. We have many examples of this, like what he did to Adam and Eve, the flood, which wiped out humanity, the allowing the Israelites to cross the Red Sea, and there were thousands of people who didn't make it, and the ocean closed back up on them. Turning Esther into a pillar of salt. There are many examples. God's philosophy was an eye for an eye. You spite me, I will spite you. On the contrary, Jesus taught humanity how to live, which is, if someone strikes you on the left cheek, you should turn the right and offer them forgiveness. That's not God. That's Jesus. God, do what I say or I'll get you. Jesus, try to learn to be a better person and I'll give you many chances. Okay? Very different philosophies on life. So the Puritans want to go back to that Old Testament. They make every choice directly out of the Bible. Every decision they make, they could point to an exact scripture that taught or set a precedent for that choice. Okay, does that make sense? Now, they had 5 core values which really dictated the way that they lived their life. And the consequences for not obeying these 5 values was usually death, or possibly even worse, being excommunicated. So being kicked out of the village. And remember, the Puritans, we're actually fast forwarding to the year 1692. So how long have the Puritans or the Pilgrims been in the New England colonies?
40 years.
What year did they come?
1400.
They've been in there.
1400.
No, that's Christopher Columbus.
They've been there since
1620. So they've been there for 72 years. Okay, so if I was on the Mayflower, okay, let's say I was 20 on the Mayflower. I'm a woman, okay?
You're dead.
And so at 20 I birthed. So in 1620, I was 20 years old. I birthed a child. In 1640, so this is first generation, second generation. In 1660, I have my grandchild. I'm probably not alive anymore. And it's 1692, so 1680, we're in the fourth generation, working on the fifth generation, okay? So I want you to understand that these are not the guys that were on the Mayflower, but they're the great grandchildren of the people on the Mayflower. Now, the people on the Mayflower started one colony. How many colonies do you think exist 72 years later?
Quite a
How
bit.
many towns have popped up?
A lot.
A lot, like at least 20, maybe more. Some of them fizzled out, so we don't have a really good record of how many they're actually, the Puritans really founded, but there's a lot more. So we are fast forwarding to 1692 and going to a different town than Boston. So 5 core values. Number 1. I gotta make sure I give it to you in order so you can. Okay. Alright, the first one is called, you're gonna want the names and definitions of these. So the first one is called total depravity. Okay? The word that we know out of depravity is what? Deprived. What does it mean if you're deprived?
You don't
Got
have.
nothing left.
You don't have things. Specifically, the things that you had have been taken away, like withheld. So in the Puritans' mindset, total depravity meant that you should live with as little as possible. Okay? Think like tiny house people. P.S. Oh, you all know. Not all of you must be. Miss Mueller
Yeah.
and her husband built a tiny house.
What? Man.
Yes. What is it? It's a tiny. It's like a garage, like a 1-car garage, and they live there. It has their bedroom, closets, kitchen, living room, everything.
What are you doing now, kid?
It's like a.
You're talking about one of these
Well,
things?
people have lived in them with like 3 kids.
Yes.
Yes.
I love
Yes.
Why
Is it on a trailer
Why
or
would
is
they
it
want
on
one of those?
cement?
I think it's mobile or stationary, but I'm not sure. Okay,
Yeah, freaking millennials.
so this means that what do you need to have in your house? The bare essentials. If you have a mom, a dad, and 2 kids, how many beds do you need? 2 beds. How many outfits does each person in your family need?
2.
Maybe 3, but 2 probably.
3,
One to wear,
for
one to be
church.
washing, maybe a separate one for church on Sunday. What else do you have to have inside your house?
Food.
Little
You
food.
don't have to.
No, you don't. How are you supposed to survive?
They're the Puritans. What do they have to have?
The Bible.
A Bible,
I thought they said they need the bare necessities.
a lamp, possibly to sit and read the Bible by. Okay? They have very little things.
You think they have
Okay?
a Bible in the porta potty or the outhouse?
Oh, I'm reading this thing.
I don't
Read
know.
this one.
So they pray to help them get through what they're
Okay. Number 2.
Chad, why do you have such a fat head?
Number 2 is irresistible grace.
Cause you wanted to.
I'm gonna write all of them on here so I can make sure I.
It's really hot.
Quiet. Okay. Number 2 is irresistible grace. This means that God truly does want to save you. So he truly does want to save you. Number 3 is limited atonement. Do you know what it means to atone? Anybody? I got it.
Atone?
Anybody know what atone means?
Google does.
Atone means forgiveness. Like to atone for your sins means to try to work your way back to salvation. Limited atonement means not all sins are actually forgivable. So God is not required to forgive every sin. Even if you work for atonement, He's not necessarily guaranteed to give you forgiveness. Directly related to limited atonement is unconditional election. This is a two-parter. The first part suggests that some people, before they're born even, God decides who will be saved and who will be damned. So some people are going to be saved, but some people will be damned. And this is also called predestination. Whoops. Oh my gosh, it's really great handwriting. Predestination, or fate, really, is another way to say that. So, some will be saved, some will be damned. It also means that God, the people that He chooses to be His instruments on earth, they must be respected. So those chosen by God must be respected. They're elected by God, so appointed by God. And 5 is directly related to that idea. That it is the job of the unelected to honor the elected. And those who have been chosen are as good as God Himself. They are God on earth. And it is the responsibility of everyone else to do what they say. Okay? The Puritans had a particular Bible verse, which, even saying this contradicts what I told you earlier, but that kind of led them to make certain choices also, which you're going to see in the play we're going to read. And that verse is Matthew 5:14.
Wait a minute. Wait, how are we going to see it if we're reading it?
We'll watch it.
You're going to see it played out.
Here we go.
Oh my gosh,
Are you gonna watch all of it,
I just forgot the last 3 words of this. Somebody look it up.
I can't see.
Cannot be hidden. Yeah.
Yes,
cannot be hidden.
Say that it's not
What is
something
it?
that cannot be hidden.
Okay. Sorry, you know sometimes your brain just stops working.
Your brain stops.
Your brain stops working. Okay, Matthew 5:14 says, You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. So the Puritans believed that they were the light of the world, that they were forming God's new humanity. So this meant a couple of things. First of all, it meant that they should be the best, most pure, most biblically accurate citizens that they could. So they were to be the best example of Christianity because they're the light. So what they do, other people will watch. So this is called the city on a hill philosophy. That you should be the best, most shining, perfect example of something. Okay? If I asked you for one word to describe the Puritans, what is the first word you would pick? Adjective to describe them.
Bossy.
Okay? Strict,
Mennonite.
religious, pure, good. Speaking of strict, you should also write down that Puritan children were expected to act like adults. There was no time for fun and games or play of any kind. Now, part of that was a survival tactic, right? Because they're still living in the wilderness, really. But the other part of it was just because they were mean.
You got to kiss me.
Okay. It may seem strange, but for anybody in here who's not Catholic, the Puritans are still the best example for most Protestant religions. Okay? One of the things that they have in common with almost every other religion around the world is a list of rules handed down by God for how you should behave. And what are those called?
10 Commandments.
The 10 Commandments. Okay? Almost every organized religion on the planet has some form that's similar. So these are 10 rules that people should live by. Now, we're not going to try to get them in order 1 through 10 because I can not sometimes remember all 10, let alone remember them in the right order. But let's see how many we can get. Raise your hand if you know one. Rebecca?
Oh, I think I know the second one. The right to bear arms.
No, that's not it.
Okay, another one.
I shall not commit adultery.
Yep.
Okay, let's see if we can get all the no. So, no adultery.
Do not take the Lord's name in vain.
Do not take no Lord's name in vain. No. What are the other no's?
Didn't know.
Huh?
No other gods.
No other gods before me.
Do not
Another
steal.
no. No steal.
Don't lie.
No stealing. No lying. There's one more no.
Do not be jealous.
Oh, there's 2 more. Do not covet thy neighbor's wife or goods. There's one more. The easiest one.
Do not
Shall not kill.
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 Oh.
Obviously.
Okay, and then God is there's
great.
there's only one God.
9 to 11.
Like
Isn't that thou shalt have no other gods before me?
What's 7?
the first one says put God first, and then
What's 7, Miss Underwood?
like keep holy the Sabbath.
Okay, number 9. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Number 11. Last one.
Don't misuse the name of God.
You got that. Lord's name.
I
Read through the list that you have.
The one that
What's
I
9
have
seconds on
says,
Remember the Sabbath.
Thou shalt not covet, or thou shalt not take any of the neighbors. What the heck?
That's covet.
Oh, we already did it.
Okay, Rebecca, read me what you got.
thou shalt not have other gods before me, thou shalt not make unto thee any
Oh.
image.
Bear false witness. That's the last one,
Thou
right?
shalt not take the Lord's name in vain, thou shalt remember the Sabbath, honor thy father and mother, shall not murder, shall not commit adultery, shall not steal,
What's 10?
shall not bear false witness, and shall not. Those are them.
This is the last no, sorry. Okay, bear false witness was the last one. So, there are 3 that don't start with no. Remember the Sabbath, honor thy mother and father. Oh, actually only 2. Only 2 that don't start with no. Actually, they start with thou shalt not.
Riley, can you put your
So
hand
there's
down?
2 that don't start with thou shalt not. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and honor thy mother and father. All the others are thou shalt not. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not use the Lord's name in vain. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or goods. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Which means you can't say, I am saved, and be lying about it. Really. Lying or okay? Covet means want, kind of like jealousy. So you shouldn't want things that you don't have. Adultery is cheating. All the rest of them are pretty self-explanatory. Okay, under the 10 Commandments, you can write Sabbath.
Hang on, don't.
What is Sabbath day?
Sunday.
Saturday.
Sunday.
In the Bible,
Puritan, it's Sunday.
in the Bible, it means the 7th day, the day of rest. Now, there are debates among, in modern
Chad,
culture.
you choose a side and pick it because
It's obviously Wednesday, hump day.
In modern society, there is disagreement whether it's Saturday or Sunday. For the purposes of this, it doesn't really matter. What you need to know is it represents the 7th day in the Bible, and the Bible says on the 7th day, God rested. The Puritans interpreted that literally, meaning they did nothing on Sundays except go to church, go home and eat a meal that was pre-cooked, and then sit in silent reflection and pray.
I sleep.
They did not work. The only work that was allowed were activities that were going to like prolong life. For instance, if you have animals, you still have to feed them, but you don't give vaccinations or shear them or do anything fancy. You just take and feed and water them and then go back home. And the Puritans were very strict in the way that they interpreted these 10 Commandments, including the Sabbath day. So, you didn't work. People who did were considered unholy. We're going to get to that tomorrow because the bell is about to ring. So, this, remember that the 10 Commandments are applicable to most religions around the world. So most religions around the world have some form of the 10 Commandments. Okay, tomorrow we're going to watch a little YouTube video to finish up religion, and then, actually not tomorrow.
Sunday is Sabbath. No, right? Right, Thomas, listen, I'm not Catholic. I just get that good grind and that good bread. So I don't get one. I just get the eggs and the body.